Imagine you're backed into a corner. On one side, you have a man demanding you write him a check for $350 billion. Not as a loan, not as a promise for the future, but as an upfront cash payment. He makes it clear that if you don't, he'll make it impossible for your business to survive. You try to explain that you simply don't have that kind of money, that a demand like this could trigger a full-blown financial crisis. But before you can even get the words out, a stern-faced doctor on your other side slides a medical chart across the table. It shows your country has the fastest aging population in the world, a demographic time bomb. He points to another number. Your national debt, which is on track to explode to over 150% of your entire economy. His diagnosis is cold and clear. You can't afford any new expenses. In fact, you need to start cutting back immediately or you're headed for systemic collapse. This isn't a scene from a movie. This is the jaw-dropping reality South Korea is facing right now, caught between an impossible demand from its most powerful ally and an unavoidable internal crisis. One threatens to bankrupt them today, the other guarantees it tomorrow. Wow. That opening scenario really does capture the sheer weight of this moment, doesn't it? For policymakers in Seoul, this isn't some abstract risk model. It feels like a real vice closing in.
It really is an unprecedented squeeze, a perfect storm almost.
Yeah.
So our mission today in this deep dive is to unpack this dual crisis South Korea is facing. First, we need to get into the specifics of this enormous demand from the U.S. It requires immediate dollar liquidity, which is a huge problem in itself.
Right.
And second, we have to look at the internal situation, this slow-motion fiscal train wreck, you could call it, driven by skyrocketing debt and those really stark demographics.
And the crucial link, the thing that makes both crises so much more dangerous.
It's South Korea's fundamental structural constraint. Its status as a non-reserve currency nation.
Yeah.
That dramatically limits its options, its maneuvering room.
So it's not just about how much debt they have, it's about the kind of currency their economy relies on. That's what makes the difference between, say, resilience and potential instability, yeah.
Exactly. Let's start with the immediate threat then, the price tag on the alliance.
Okay, so the figure we're talking about is just staggering. $350 billion, that's around 485 trillion won. Now, this started, didn't it, as an investment pledge from Seoul? Kind of a verbal agreement.
That's right. It was primarily in exchange for the U.S. agreeing to lower tariffs on key South Korean exports, dropping them from that really punitive 25% level down to 15%.
It sounds like, fairly standard trade negotiation on the surface.
It does, but it's the sheer size of the ask and then the subsequent shift in how it had to be paid. That's what blew this up into a potential crisis.
So the initial idea was market access for economic engagement.
Pretty much. Guaranteed access to the huge U.S. market at lower tariffs in return for, significant economic partnership. But the controversy really ignited when the structure of that investment got defined, or rather redefined. President Trump has apparently insisted that this huge contribution must be upfront, cash or equity.
Not a gradual investment over years or loans tied to projects.
No, this is a demand for a highly liquid, immediate commitment. Cash on the barrelhead, essentially.
And that insistence on cash just completely pulls the rug out from under Korea's initial strategy, right? They were planning on loans, guarantees, things that don't drain your reserves overnight.
Precisely. Loans are manageable over time. Cash equity demands immediate liquidity. It fundamentally changes the risk profile.
And the Korean government's reaction wasn't just political posturing.
Not at all. It was a pretty stark statement of financial impossibility. The National Security Advisor, Wee Sung-lak, he was very explicit. He said, $350 billion is objectively and realistically not a level we are able to handle.
Wow.
And he stressed, we are not able to pay $350 billion in cash. They're essentially signaling that meeting the demand as it's currently framed could trigger a currency crisis.
Okay, so to understand why it's not just difficult, but potentially catastrophic, we need to look at their foreign reserves. That's the national safety net.
Exactly. And the numbers here are, frankly, alarming. $350 billion is about 84% of South Korea's total foreign exchange reserves.
Let that sink in, 84%.
As of the end of last month, those reserves stood at around $416.3 billion. These reserves are your country's ultimate shield against external shocks and currency runs, sudden capital outflows. Asking for 84% of that shield to be handed over. It's almost like asking someone to fight a fire after taking away most of their water. It undermines confidence.
And the comparison with Japan, which the U.S. side keeps bringing up, really highlights how disproportionate this burden is for South Korea.
It really does. Japan committed an even bigger headline number, $550 billion. But here's the key difference. Japan's foreign exchange reserves are vastly larger, over $1.3 trillion.
So for Japan, $550 billion is.
It's still a lot of money, obviously, but it's only about 41.5% of their reserves. Japan can manage that kind of outflow without necessarily destabilizing the yen or causing panic in the markets.
But for South Korea, it's double the relative impact on reserves.
Double the impact, yes. And crucially, the consequences of draining those reserves are far more severe because the Korean won isn't a global reserve currency like the yen or the dollar. The market reaction is likely to be much sharper.
Let's dig into that immediate risk then. If Seoul gets pushed into an arrangement like Japan's, where maybe the money needs to be ready quickly, say, within 45 days of a project getting the green light, what actually happens in the markets?
Well, the reaction could be almost instantaneous. Even if the whole $350 billion isn't spent on day one, just the requirement to have large chunks of dollars ready to go, dollars that are currently held as reserves or by commercial banks, that would create a massive sudden demand for dollars and supply of won.
A huge drain.
A huge drain, yeah. It would severely deplete the reserves the Bank of Korea uses to keep the won stable. You'd almost certainly see a rapid drop in the won's value and exchange rate shock.
And that means?
Higher inflation, definitely, because imports suddenly cost a lot more. And potentially capital flight. As investors get nervous about stability, it's a dangerous spiral.
It's so important to connect these huge macro numbers to what it means for people on the ground. You mentioned this kind of abstract geopolitical risk.
Yeah.
How does that actually hit, say, a small business owner?
This is where stories like Mr. Lee's and Ulsan become really telling. He runs a factory, makes specialized plastic components for American car dashboards. His whole business model depends on stable, predictable trade.
Okay.
So when these negotiations hit this major snag and the threat of those 25% tariffs returning suddenly felt very real, what happened? His biggest American client didn't wait. They immediately put a hold on all new orders.
Just halted them because of the uncertainty.
Exactly. Citing the risk, the potential costs. So Mr. Lee's factory, his income, his employees' jobs, they're immediately impacted not even by tariffs being imposed, but just by the risk created by this huge financial demand on his government.
Wow. So for him, that $350 billion isn't some abstract number in the news.
Not at all. It's a direct threat to his livelihood, his payroll, everything he's built. The geopolitical chess game translates directly into frozen orders and real anxiety for small and medium-sized businesses, which are the backbone of Korea's export economy. The government's choices have immediate real-world consequences.
And that fragility, that vulnerability to a currency shock, it all ties back to South Korea's position in the global financial system, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Which brings us squarely to the structural constraint that underlies all of this. Yes, this concept of the non-reserve currency trap. It's really the lens we have to view this entire crisis through. It's fundamental.
The difference between having a key global currency, like the US dollar or the Japanese yen, and having one mainly used domestically, it's like playing two different games, isn't it?
It really is. It's the difference between having a degree of financial sovereignty and being, well, perpetually more vulnerable to external pressures and market sentiment.
So let's break down the mechanics. How does Japan raise its $550 billion commitment compared to how Korea would have to find $350 billion?
Okay, so Japan, because the yen is a major international currency, has very high national credibility in financial markets. Japanese entities, the government, banks, major corporations, they can issue dollar bonds relatively easily.
Bonds denominated in US dollars.
Exactly. They can go directly to the global market and borrow the dollars they need. International investors are generally comfortable buying these bonds because they trust the Japanese economy, and the yen is easily convertible. They're basically sourcing dollars directly from where dollars are abundant.
Right. But South Korea can't really do that on the same scale.
That's the constraint, precisely. Issuing dollar-denominated bonds is much harder for Korean entities, especially for such a massive amount, $350 billion. It's not impossible, but it's difficult and expensive. So what would they likely have to do instead? They'd primarily issue won-denominated bonds in their own domestic market, borrowing one from Korean citizens, banks, pension funds.
Okay, so they raise a mountain of won.
And then they have to take that huge pile of won and go into the foreign exchange market to buy $350 billion.
And that massive conversion, that's where the danger lies.
That's the potential explosion point. The Bank of Korea, or whoever is managing this, would effectively be flooding the market with won while simultaneously trying to suck up an enormous volume of dollars. Basic supply and demand.
The price of the dollar skyrockets relative to the won.
Rapidly. You'd see a sharp, possibly uncontrolled depreciation of the won, which, as we said, means imports get vastly more expensive. Think oil, raw materials, food fueling inflation, hurting consumers and making it harder for businesses. It's like the U.S. demand forces Korea to inflict financial pain on itself just to comply.
Which explains why this idea of a currency swap agreement is so absolutely critical in these negotiations. It's like a financial lifeline.
It's exactly that. Think of a currency swap like a prearranged emergency credit line between central banks. In this case, it would be between the U.S. Federal Reserve and the Bank of Korea.
How does it work?
It allows one country, say South Korea, to borrow the other's currency dollars during a crisis or liquidity crunch at a pre-agreed stable exchange rate. It basically lets them bypass the volatile open market when they desperately need dollars.
And Japan has the ultimate version of this.
They do. Japan has an unlimited, permanent currency swap agreement with the U.S. Fed. It's a sign of incredibly deep financial integration and trust. If Japan ever faces a massive dollar need, they have an instant, essentially bottomless source of dollar liquidity.
Which just throws South Korea's vulnerability into really sharp relief.
Absolutely. South Korea had a temporary currency swap with the U.S., but it expired back in 2021. That safety net is gone. And facing a $350 billion demand without it, that's a huge exposure.
It severely limits their flexibility.
Completely. It forces them to confront that risky open market conversion we just talked about. That's why reviving this swap, ideally an unlimited one, is probably Seoul's top priority in these talks. It's seen as a basic safety measure.
And the potential need is huge. Some analysts have tried to quantify it.
Yeah, Citibank analysts ran some numbers. They estimated that if this whole $350 billion investment has to be solely funded by, say, 2028, South Korea might need to find and exchange up to $96 billion per year.
$96 billion a year.
Just think about managing that scale of foreign currency exchange year after year without a guaranteed backup line. It's almost impossible without causing market chaos. An unlimited swap becomes practically essential to manage that kind of liquidity risk smoothly. It might be the only way to facilitate the investment without crashing their own currency.
It really sounds like the difference between being a major shareholder in the global financial system and maybe being like a valued customer, but still a customer.
That's a good way to put it.
This reminds me of that anecdote about Ji-hoon, the finance PhD student, trying to explain this to his friend.
Oh yeah, that story perfectly captures the frustration, doesn't it? Ji-hoon was trying to get his peer to understand why $350 billion was manageable, or at least less catastrophic, for Japan than for Korea.
And his analogy was?
He likened Japan's unlimited swap line to having a direct, open credit line from a major bank, high trust, no collateral needed. But for South Korea, without that swap, trying to get $350 billion is like going to a really volatile, high-interest lender on the open market,
where the price of the loan, the dollar exchange rate, could just shoot up overnight because of the sheer size of your request.
Exactly. Predictable funding versus incredibly volatile, potentially ruinously expensive funding. And this fundamental difference is also reflected in the size of their national financial cushions, their net external assets.
Right. The country's overall savings account, essentially.
Sort of, yeah. It's what domestic residents and institutions own abroad, minus what foreigners own within the country. It's a buffer against external shocks. Japan's buffer is just enormous. It was $3.62 trillion at the end of last year.
Built up over decades.
Decades, yeah. Leveraging their manufacturing might, huge trade surpluses going back to the 80s. They built this massive cushion, even weathering their own economic bubble burst.
And South Korea's buffer.
It's substantial now, but much, much smaller and newer. About $1.03 trillion as of Q2 this year. And here's a key point. South Korea only achieved a net external asset surplus, meaning they owned more abroad than foreigners owned at home for the first time in 2014.
So their buffer is less than a decade old, really.
And less than a third the size of Japan's. It's just a much shallower pool to draw from when facing a potential $350 billion drain.
So putting it all together, a smaller, newer buffer, no guaranteed dollar safety net via a swap, and difficulty raising dollars directly. It suddenly makes the president's warning about risking another 1997-style crisis sound less like political rhetoric and more like a statement of fact about their structural vulnerability.
It really does. It highlights the inherent risks for a non-reserve currency, small, open economy facing this kind of external pressure.
And the terrifying thing is, this external squeeze is hitting them at the exact moment they're grappling with a huge, looming internal crisis.
That's the other side of this vice grip. The demographic time bomb and the exploding national debt.
Okay, so let's pivot from the external demand to the internal finances, because this really shows why South Korea has almost zero wiggle room to handle something like a $350 billion shock. the IMF's latest debt projections, they hit a kind of quiet but critical milestone, didn't they?
They did. And it's the kind of danger that often gets lost in the big international headlines about trade deals. The IMF projects that Korea's general government debt to GDP ratio is set to hit 54.5% in 2025.
Now, as you said, in the U.S., debt to GDP is way over 100%. Japan's over 200%, so 54.5%. Why should that number set off alarm bells for South Korea? It sounds relatively modest.
It sounds modest if you compare it to the U.S. or Japan, but that's the wrong comparison. That 54.5% figure is significant because it marks the first time Korea is projected to surpass the average debt ratio for its actual peer group.
And that peer group is?
It's a group of 11 non-reserve currency advanced economies identified by the IMF. Think countries like Norway, Singapore, the Czech Republic, Israel. These are the economies that share Korea's structural constraints. Their average debt to GDP is around 54.3%.
Okay, so Korea is about to cross the average for its specific group. Why is that threshold so important for non-reserve nations? Why do they need to keep debt lower?
It boils down to market trust and financing capacity again. If U.S. debt hits 130%, the world still needs dollars, still buys U.S. Treasury bonds. The dollar's global role provides a huge safety margin. But if Korea's debt ratio goes significantly above its peer average, and especially if it starts approaching thresholds like 60%, it sends a worrying signal to international credit rating agencies and investors.
A signal that fiscal discipline might be slipping.
Exactly. And without the safety net of a reserve currency, a credit rating downgrade can happen faster and have much harsher consequences. It could trigger capital flight, make it way more expensive to borrow money to service the existing debt. It becomes a negative feedback loop.
And this isn't just a slow creep upwards. The projected trajectory is steep, and it's rooted firmly in demographics, right?
Absolutely. Demographics are the engine driving the future spending explosion. South Korea has the fastest aging population on the planet, combined with the world's lowest birth rate. It's a demographic pincer movement.
Fewer workers paying taxes, more retirees needing pensions and health care.
Precisely. So without major, painful structural reforms, pension reform, healthcare reform, labor market changes, the government's own projections are dire. The Ministry of Economy and Finance warns the debt to GDP ratio could hit 71.5% in just 10 years.
10 years and longer term.
Longer term, it's genuinely a fiscal collapse scenario. By 2065, without reform, that ratio is projected to skyrocket to 156.3%.
Over 150%.
Which basically means the government would likely be spending more just servicing its debt and paying legally mandated benefits than it collects in taxes. That leads towards insolvency unless you have massive tax hikes or brutal cuts to services.
So you have this external demand for cash now, hitting a system that internal forecasts say needs to start cutting spending immediately to avoid future bankruptcy. This must create a huge conflict in fiscal policy.
It does. You have international bodies like the IMF and the OECD essentially shouting from the rooftops about the need for urgent reform and fiscal prudence.
What are they recommending specifically?
The IMF has been pushing hard for Korea to adopt a reliable, medium-term fiscal anchor, basically. Legally binding rules to control spending, like the EU's 60% debt-to-GDP standard. They point out Korea is one of only 2 OECD countries without such rules. The OECD projects debt could exceed 140% by 2060 without action. They're advising strict fiscal discipline now.
But the current government's stance has been more towards expansionary policy.
Yes, the argument from the current administration has often been that the absolute debt level isn't the main issue, especially when compared to G7 countries like the US or Germany, whose ratios are much higher.
But that comparison is flawed.
Experts, and the IMF, argue it's fundamentally flawed and potentially dangerous. Those G7 nations are reserve currency countries. They can finance deficits much more easily. They can, in extremis, print money. South Korea cannot print dollars to pay its debts or satisfy foreign bondholders. So the warning is, if Korea's debt ratio blows past 60% and keeps accelerating, that lack of reserve currency status means a crisis could be triggered much more easily than in a G7 nation. It's comparing apples and oranges and ignoring the core structural vulnerability.
This internal pressure, the shadow of future bankruptcy, it must create a lot of anxiety for ordinary people, especially those caught in the middle, like the sandwich generation.
Absolutely. You hear stories like Sujin's, a 38-year-old graphic designer. She represents so many people facing this systemic risk.
How so?
Well, she's doing everything society asks. She's a successful professional, paying her taxes, contributing to her own pension fund. But at the same time, she's helping support her aging parents. They're the leading edge of this demographic wave.
And she's paying into a national pension and healthcare system that she has deep, nagging fears will simply be insolvent by the time she retires and needs it herself.
So the very social spending that's needed now for her parents and eventually for her is driving the debt that threatens the long-term survival of those exact programs.
That's the cruel paradox. She needs the social safety net, but she's terrified that the combination of the government's current spending trajectory and huge external demands like this $350 billion will bankrupt the state, leaving her daughter's generation with an impossible burden.
Every dollar demanded by the U.S., every one spent today without clear funding, feels like another shovel digging the hole deeper.
It creates this quiet, pervasive crisis of confidence in the future, which makes the need for incredibly careful strategic negotiation with the U.S. even more critical. They're walking the tightest of tightropes.
Okay, let's focus on those negotiations then, the ones currently underway with the trade minister in the U.S. We know the big sticking point is cash versus loans. But you mentioned deeper issues around control and profit. Yeah, the structure debate isn't just about liquidity, it's about who benefits. The U.S. preference for upfront cash equity suggests Washington wants significant control over how that $350 billion is invested. And some reports indicate the U.S. side expects American firms and supply chains to capture the lion's share, maybe up to 90% of the profits generated from these investments.
Wait, so Korea provides the capital, takes almost all the risk to its financial stability,
and potentially gets only a small fraction of the upside.
That sounds less like a mutual investment and more like, well, a geopolitical levy, another pax.
Which is exactly why Seoul is pushing back so hard. Their counter-proposals are trying to achieve a few key things. First, shift the structure back towards loans or guarantees money that only flows if specific commercial projects falter.
Okay.
Second, insisting on commercial viability. They want assurances these aren't just political payoffs, but investments that actually make economic sense and generate returns for Korea too.
And third, the non-negotiable.
The currency swap revival. They see that as a fundamental prerequisite, a basic market safety measure needed before they can even contemplate this scale of dollar outflow.
The stakes have been made incredibly clear, even by the South Korean president himself. His warnings about the domestic fallout were unusually strong.
They were, and probably very calculated. He explicitly warned that accepting the current U.S. demands without safeguards, specifically mentioning the currency swap, could risk a repeat of the 1997 financial crisis.
And he even
raised the possibility of impeachment, essentially framing it as agreeing to terms that destabilize the national economy to meet an external demand could be seen as such a severe failure of leadership, it might have constitutional consequences. That really underlines this isn't just policy disagreement. It's seen as potentially threatening national financial survival.
That level of rhetoric signals extreme tension, and we are seeing some friction playing out publicly.
We are. For example, the U.S. Commerce Secretary publicly suggesting South Korea should just accept terms similar to Japan's deal.
Which completely ignores all the structural differences we've just discussed.
Exactly. It dismisses Korea's unique vulnerabilities. And this kind of high-profile public disagreement makes experts nervous because it raises the risk of sudden punitive actions by the U.S., perhaps targeting key Korean exports if Washington feels Seoul isn't being cooperative enough.
And those export sectors are critical pillars of the Korean economy. Which ones are most vulnerable if things sour?
You're primarily looking at automobiles, semiconductors, the memory chips and logic chips and pharmaceuticals. These are massive export earners for Korea.
So any sudden tariffs, customs delays, new regulations?
It could be devastating. It would hit the trade balance hard and fast and put companies like Mr. Lee's and thousands of others under immediate threat. The economic interdependence is huge, which forces Seoul to navigate very, very carefully.
So given all this, the non-reserve currency status, the internal debt bomb, the external pressure, what's the consensus view on the best negotiation strategy for South Korea?
The consistent advice seems to be cautious and low-profile negotiation. Avoid public spats that could provoke retaliation. Keep the dialogue channels open, but be firm on core interests. And the central pillar of their current strategy seems to be leveraging the currency swap demand itself.
So it's a kind of strong-to-strong approach, using their need for the swap as leverage to perhaps reduce the cash component of the $350 billion.
That seems to be the play. They're essentially saying, look, we understand the strategic importance of this investment to the alliance. But for us, as a non-reserve currency nation, the mechanics of funding it require you, our ally, to provide this basic financial safety net first.
Trading liquidity security for a concession on the upfront cash.
Precisely. They're hoping the U.S. values the overall $350 billion commitment enough to grant the swap, which, ironically, is what would make fulfilling that commitment possible without Korea's economy potentially imploding in the process. It's a really delicate, high-stakes balancing act.
This deep dive really lays bare the incredibly difficult position South Korea finds itself in, caught in this double bind. On one hand, an immediate, externally driven financial crisis demanding dollar liquidity now. On the other, a long-term, internally driven fiscal crisis demanding one austerity and painful reforms soon.
And both crises are massively amplified by that fundamental vulnerability being a non-reserve currency country.
The choices facing Seoul seem agonizing. It's not about choosing between good options, is it? It's about managing two potential forms of bankruptcy, one possibly triggered by diplomacy, the other guaranteed by demographics.
And they have to do it with far fewer tools in their financial toolkit compared to their major G7 allies. No unlimited swap, no ability to print the world's reserve currency, a relatively smaller reserve pool.
I think the ultimate takeaway here isn't just about the specific deal or Korea's debt numbers. It's a really stark lesson in what financial sovereignty, or the lack of it, means in today's world.
It really is. The price of delaying necessary fiscal reforms, combined with the inherent limitations of not having a key global currency, means that a request from even your closest ally can suddenly become an existential threat.
South Korea's predicament makes one thing brutally clear. When the geopolitical price tag is $350 billion, your national debt situation and, crucially, your currency status in the world are what ultimately determine if you can even afford to pay.